The dust motes danced in the single beam of light that cut through the darkened theater like a forgotten prayer. It was well past 11, and the old Riverside Community Theater should have been empty, locked tight against the Memphis night. But Harold Winters had heard the footsteps again, that deliberate rhythm echoing from somewhere beyond the stage door, where only actors and dreamers dared to venture after the audiences had long gone home. Subscribe to our channel for more untold stories that shape the legends we know today. These are the moments that happened when nobody was watching, yet changed everything. Harold had been teaching acting in this cramped theater for 37 years, long enough to recognize the sound of someone walking with purpose through the maze of narrow hallways and storage rooms that honeycombed the building's backstage areas. Most students stumbled through those passages, bumping into costume racks and tripping over coiled cables in the perpetual twilight of theatrical spaces. But these footsteps belonged to someone who moved like they understood that every surface in a theater held memory. Every shadow contained the ghost of a performance that had once mattered to somebody. The theater itself was a relic from the 1940s, all creaking wooden floors and walls that had absorbed decades of whispered lines and nervous breakdowns. Harold loved the building's imperfections, the way the stage lights cast uneven pools of warmth. This was real theater, the kind where actors learned to project not just their voices, but their very souls into the darkness beyond the footlights. He had stayed late tonight because tomorrow's class would be different. Word had spread through the small Memphis acting community that someone unexpected was coming to audit his evening session. Someone older than his usual students, someone who had been turned away from other programs because of their age. Harold specialized in what he called late bloomers, actors who had discovered their calling after life had already assigned them other roles. He understood the particular hunger that drove people to step onto a stage for the first time when their contemporaries were settling into retirement. The footsteps stopped just outside his classroom door. Harold waited, knowing from experience that this moment of hesitation meant everything. Some people knocked immediately, eager to announce themselves. Others lingered in the hallway, gathering courage or reconsidering their decision entirely. The truly serious ones stood quietly for a moment, listening to the silence, preparing themselves for whatever lay beyond the threshold. When the door finally opened, Harold looked up from his gradebook to see a tall man in his late 40s, moving with the careful dignity of someone who had learned to carry himself with intention. The man's eyes swept the room, taking in the folding chairs arranged in a semicircle, the mirror-lined walls, the small stage, area where Harold conducted his exercises. There was something in that gaze that Harold recognized immediately, the quality of deep attention that separated real actors from people who merely wanted to be seen. "Mr. Winters, I'm here about the evening classes." The voice carried weight, each word carefully placed, with a resonance that seemed to emerge from somewhere deeper than the throat. Harold nodded toward one of the chairs, noting how the man moved across the room, unhurried but purposeful, aware of his body and space without being self-conscious about it. "What brings you to acting at this stage of your life?" Harold asked, setting aside his pen. It was a question he posed to every prospective student, but the answer always revealed whether someone was running toward something or away from it. The man settled into his chair, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I've been narrating stories my whole life, but always other people's words. I want to understand what it means to inhabit a character, to find truth in fiction." He paused, looking directly at Harold with an openness that was rare in new students. "I suppose I'm curious about the difference between speaking lines and living them." Harold had heard variations of this explanation hundreds of times, but something in the way this man articulated his desire suggested a deeper understanding of what acting actually required. Most people thought acting was about pretending. The best actors knew it was about discovering which parts of themselves could authentically serve the character's journey. "Acting isn't about transformation," Harold began, settling into the rhythm of explanation he had refined over decades of teaching. "It's about excavation. We don't become different people on stage. We uncover aspects of ourselves that we might never access in daily life." He gestured toward the mirror that dominated one wall of the classroom. "That glass doesn't lie. It shows us exactly what we're bringing to a role. Nothing more, nothing less." The real work began with silence. Harold had developed his teaching philosophy around a simple premise. Most actors were too eager to fill space with movement and words, afraid that stillness would reveal their inadequacy. In reality, the ability to be fully present without doing anything was the foundation of all meaningful performance. He called it earning your place on stage. Before we worry about delivering lines or finding emotional truth, Harold explained, we need to establish your baseline. I want you to stand center stage and simply exist there for 2 full minutes without moving, without speaking, without trying to communicate anything except your presence. The exercise seemed simple enough, but Harold watched carefully as the man moved to the designated spot and settled into position. Most students began the stillness exercise with visible tension, their bodies broadcasting discomfort with being observed. They shifted weight from foot to foot, adjusted their clothing, or let their eyes dart around the room as if seeking permission to occupy the space they had been given. But this student found his center almost immediately, his breathing settling into a natural rhythm as his gaze softened into the middle distance. There was no performance in his stillness, no attempt to project calm or confidence. He simply stood there, inhabiting his own body with the kind of unselfconscious presence that usually took months to develop. Harold found himself leaning forward slightly, studying the quality of attention this man brought to such a basic exercise. In 37 years of teaching, he had seen perhaps a dozen students who possessed this kind of natural groundedness, this ability to command attention through the simple act of being fully present. It wasn't charisma exactly, though there was certainly magnetism in the way he occupied space. It was more fundamental than that, a quality of deep listening that made the room itself seem more attentive. When the 2 minutes concluded, Harold made a note in his gradebook. Though he knew already that traditional assessment categories would not adequately capture what he had just witnessed, this was not technique that could be taught or talent that could be cultivated through repetition. This was the kind of presence that emerged from years of careful attention to the world, the accumulated wisdom of someone who had learned to observe life with genuine curiosity rather than judgment. 3 weeks into the evening session, Harold received an unexpected delivery. A casting director from a regional theater company had dropped off a single page of audition material, a small role in an upcoming production that required what she described as gravitas without grandstanding. The part consisted of fewer than 20 lines, scattered across 2 brief scenes. But Harold recognized immediately that this was the kind of opportunity his older students rarely encountered. The character was a judge presiding over a case that would determine the fate of a young man accused of a crime he may or may not have committed. The writing was economical, each line carrying the weight of consequence, demanding an actor who could convey wisdom, weariness, and moral authority without relying on theatrical gestures or vocal pyrotechnics. It was a role that required presence rather than performance, the kind of part that could only be played by someone who understood the difference between commanding attention and demanding it. Harold made copies of the sides for his entire class, but as he distributed the pages, he found his attention drawn repeatedly to the tall man who had been attending sessions with such dedicated consistency. Over the past 3 weeks, this student had distinguished himself not through dramatic breakthrough moments or emotional displays, but through his willingness to approach each exercise with methodical care, building his understanding of craft layer by careful layer. I want each of you to prepare this monologue for next week, Harold announced, referring to the judge's longest speech, a meditation on justice that appeared near the end of the second scene. But remember, this character has been listening to testimony for hours before he speaks these words. He's not making an argument or delivering a verdict. He's sharing the weight of responsibility that comes with having to judge another human being. Harold watched as his students absorbed this direction, some already beginning to gesture dramatically as they read through the material. But the man in the back row sat quietly, his eyes moving across the page with the kind of careful attention usually reserved for sacred texts. He seemed to understand instinctively that the power of these words would emerge not from how forcefully they were delivered, but from the accumulated authority of someone who had genuinely wrestled with their implications. The following Tuesday, Harold called his students to the stage one by one, each taking their turn with the judge's monologue. Some approached the material with theatrical gravity, their voices dropping to portentous whispers. Others projected stern authority, turning the character's moral wrestling into a stern lecture. A few tried to find the humanity in the judge's dilemma, but their interpretations felt forced, emotions manufactured rather than discovered. When Harold finally called the tall man forward, the quality of attention in the room shifted almost imperceptibly. The other students, who had been chatting quietly between performances, settled into genuine listening. Something about the way this man moved to center stage, unhurried but purposeful, suggested that what they were about to witness would be different from what had come before. He stood quietly for a long moment, not preparing or gathering himself, but simply allowing the weight of the character's situation to settle around him like a familiar coat. When he finally spoke, his voice carried no artificial gravity, no manufactured authority. Instead, each word emerged from a place of genuine consideration, as if the judge's moral dilemma was something he had personally wrestled with in the hours before dawn. "The law asks us to determine guilt or innocence based on evidence and precedent," he began, his gaze directed not at the classroom, but towards some invisible defendant whose fate hung in the balance. "But what do we do when the evidence tells one story and our hearts whisper another? What do we do when justice and mercy seem to pull in opposite directions?" Harold found himself holding his breath, recognizing that something extraordinary was happening. This was not a student performing lines he had memorized. This was an actor inhabiting a character's deepest uncertainties, allowing the audience to witness the precise moment when abstract principles collided with human complexity. The man's voice never rose above conversational volume, but each word seemed to expand in the silence that followed, creating space for thoughts and feelings that extended far beyond the immediate moment. "I have sat in this chair for 23 years, the character continued, "and I have learned that the heaviest verdicts are not the ones that condemn, but the ones that absolve. When we choose mercy, we accept responsibility for whatever consequences follow. When we choose justice, we risk forgetting that the person before us is someone's child, someone's hope for redemption." The room had become completely still, not the restless quiet of students waiting for a performance to end, but the profound silence that emerges when an audience recognizes they are witnessing something authentic. Harold felt the familiar tightness in his chest that accompanied moments of genuine theatrical truth. Those rare instances when the boundary between actor and character dissolves so completely that the performance becomes a form of revelation. As the monologue reached its conclusion, Harold found himself studying not just the student's performance, but the way his presence had transformed the entire classroom. The folding chairs, the fluorescent lights, the scuffed linoleum floor had somehow become the chambers of an actual courtroom, and everyone present understood they were witnessing a judge's most private struggle with the impossibility of perfect justice. "In the end," the character concluded, his voice carrying the exhaustion of someone who had spent decades making decisions that would alter other people's lives, "we do our best with imperfect information and hope that our intentions matter as much as our conclusions. We hope that the people whose fates we determine understand we carry their stories long after the gavel falls." The silence that followed was not the pause of an audience waiting to applaud, but the contemplative quiet that follows any encounter with genuine truth. Harold realized he was witnessing something that happened perhaps once in a teaching career, the moment when a student's natural gifts aligned so perfectly with their understanding of craft that the result transcended both technique and talent. When the man finally stepped back from center stage, returning to his chair with the same unhurried grace he had displayed since his first evening in class, Harold found himself making a decision that would alter not just this student's trajectory, but his own understanding of what teaching could accomplish. "That's enough for tonight," Harold announced, though they still had 40 minutes remaining in the session. "I want everyone to go home and think about what we just witnessed, not the technique, not the interpretation, but the quality of truth that emerged when someone fully committed to serving the character rather than showcasing themselves." After the other students had gathered their belongings and disappeared into the Memphis night, Harold found himself alone with the man who had just demonstrated what decades of teaching had been leading toward. They sat in the classroom's fluorescent afterglow, surrounded by the particular stillness that settles over spaces where something significant has just occurred. "You understand what happened here tonight?" Harold asked, his voice carrying the weight of recognition he had been accumulating throughout the evening's session. The man nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful rather than triumphant. I think I began to understand the difference between reading words and living them, he said. The judge's struggle became real because I allowed myself to feel the actual weight of having to make impossible choices. Harold smiled, recognizing in this response the kind of insight that separated actors from performers. Most people come to acting because they want to become someone else, he said. The best actors discover they were always enough. They just needed to learn how to access what was already there. They talked for another hour, Harold sharing insights from his decades in the theater, the student asking questions that revealed both humility and a deep hunger for understanding. As midnight approached and the building's night shift janitor began making his rounds, Harold realized he was looking at someone whose relationship with performance would extend far beyond the boundaries of this small community theater. The casting director who dropped off those sides, Harold said as they prepared to leave. She mentioned they're looking for someone with presence rather than flash, someone who can command attention without demanding it. He handed the man a business card, knowing that this conversation was both an ending and a beginning. As they walked through the darkened theater toward the lobby, Harold found himself thinking about the metaphor of late doors, the opportunities that arrive when most people assume the building is closed for the night. Some actors spent their entire careers waiting for the right moment, the perfect role, the ideal circumstances. The best ones understood that readiness was something you carried with you. That presence was not a switch you could flip when the spotlight found you, but a quality you cultivated in empty classrooms and forgotten corners where nobody was watching. Harold locked the theater's main entrance and walked with his student to the parking lot. As they shook hands and prepared to drive in different directions, Harold realized that tomorrow he would call the casting director and recommend someone whose name she did not yet know, but whose presence she would never forget. The next morning, Harold arrived early to find the theater exactly as they had left it, but somehow changed. The classroom where last night's revelation had occurred seemed to hold the memory of what had transpired there, as if the walls themselves had absorbed something significant. He moved through his usual routine of preparation, arranging chairs and reviewing lesson plans, but found his attention repeatedly drawn to the spot where his student had stood while delivering the judge's monologue. In 37 years of teaching, Harold had developed the ability to recognize potential in its earliest stages, to see the difference between students who wanted to act and those who needed to act. But last night had presented him with something rarer, someone who possessed not just natural ability, but the wisdom to serve that ability rather than be seduced by it. He thought about the phone call he would make to the regional theater, the conversation that would begin with technical details, but would inevitably become something larger, a discussion about the qualities that separated mere competence from genuine artistry. Harold had made similar calls dozens of times over the years, but he understood that this recommendation carried different weight. The casting director would expect him to describe vocal range and movement capabilities. Instead, Harold would find himself talking about presence, about the rare ability to make silence feel like music. As the morning light filtered through the theater's high windows, Harold made a note in his teaching journal, recording not just the events of the previous evening, but his growing certainty that he had witnessed something that would extend far beyond the boundaries of this small Memphis theater. Some doors, he wrote, only open when we are ready to walk through them. The students who find those doors understand that the real audition is not the moment when someone is watching, but the years of preparation that happen when the theater is dark. Harold closed his journal and prepared for another day of teaching, carrying with him the satisfaction of someone who had planted a seed that would grow far beyond anything he could imagine. In the months that would follow, he would occasionally hear that distinctive voice emerging from radios and theater stages, always recognizable by its quality of deep attention, its commitment to truth over performance. But tonight, in the quiet classroom of a small community theater in Memphis, Harold would remember the moment when potential became presence, when a student's willingness to serve the work rather than showcase himself created the kind of truth that transforms everyone who witnesses it. Some stories, he understood, were too important to keep to themselves. Some doors opened late, but when they did, they revealed paths that led far beyond anything anyone had dared to imagine.